Now I have a pleasure of inviting our British friend Neil Clark, journalist and a writer, who will address us back to the future on the way toward new global consensus. Mr. Neil Clark.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Jovanovic. And Mr. Werner, thank you for the invitation to address this distinguished conference here today in Belgrade. We're meeting here to mark the 70th anniversary, of course, of the YALTA and POTSDAM conferences and the 40th anniversary of the Helsinki Accords. I think what we can look back at the 1945 settlement, the one which ended World War II and which dealt with the new post-war world, as undoubtedly a progressive one, because the principle of state sovereignty was enshrined. And in fact, in that period from 1945 to 75, the period from YALTA and POTSDAM to Helsinki, I think this was a very progressive period overall in Europe and in many other areas of the world too. Not only was the change in the world order, but the economic order. And this is a very important point, that in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, we had policies that could be called majoritarian policies. Policies which benefited the majority of people on this planet. It was an era of growing democracy, genuine democracy. And it's interesting that people all over Europe now look back with great nostalgia to what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, as a period of economic growth, a period of full employment. We've heard a lot today about the terrible unemployment figures in Europe, 50% youth unemployment in Spain, 60% in Greece, and it's hard to believe that not so long ago we had full employment in all these countries, in many of the countries in Europe. And understandably, there's enormous nostalgia for this period. And it's also interesting to look at the leadership in Europe at that time. And if we look at the leadership in Western Europe, we had, I believe, superior statesmen and women to today. I'm talking about the likes of Bruno Kreisky in Austria, Charles de Gaulle, Adenauer, Schmidt, and Olof Palme in Sweden, and Harold Wilson. These people were less subservient to the United States in this Cold War, so-called Cold War period than today's European leaders, and I think that's a very interesting point to make. Let me just read a quote. Christmas 1972, the United States was bombing Vietnam, North Vietnam. And this is a quote by a political figure in 1972. "We should call things by their proper names. What is going on in Vietnam today is a form of torture. There cannot be any military justification for the bombings. People are being punished. A nation is being punished in order to humiliate it, to force it to submit to force. That's why the bombings are despicable. Many such atrocities have been perpetrated in recent history. They are often associated with the name. Guernica, Babi Yar, Katyn, Lidice, Sharpeville, Treblinka. Violence triumphed, but posterity has condemned the perpetrators. Now a new name will be added to this list. Hanoi, Christmas 1972. Question, who do you think made that very fierce condemnation of United States bombing? Was it perhaps Leonid Brezhnev, Fidel Castro? No, that was Olof Palme, who was the Prime Minister of Sweden. The point here, can you imagine a European leader, Western European leader of the last 10, 15 years coming out in such language to describe the United States bombing in Iraq, the bombing of Libya? Not, of course not. And I think that is interesting to see how Western European politics has shifted and the takeover by Atlanticists, pro-American politicians in the West, and what a tragic that's been. Because the European support for the United States has undoubtedly made the world a more dangerous place. And Palme wasn't alone. He wasn't the only Western European figure who did strongly criticize and condemn US military actions. President de Gaulle, we know, famously took France out of NATO's military command in 1966. Bruno Kreisky in Austria pursued an independent foreign policy. He pursued the cause of the Palestinian self-determination. Harold Wilson did not send British troops to Vietnam. So we had different leadership in those days. And 1975 in Helsinki really was the high point, the apogee of this period. In that same year, the gap between the rich and poor in Britain reached its lowest ever level. And that was the same in many other European countries too. This was the historically low levels of inequality. And this period of détente went hand in hand with this greater social justice at home. The changes occurred, unfortunately, it didn't last. There were hopes of many progressive people in the 70s that what was happening was the coming together of the Eastern socialist countries and the Western countries, finding a kind of social, democratic socialist kind of alternative for the future, that it would be part Kreisky's Austria, part Kardar's Hungary. This was a kind of fusion idea which was popular at the time. Tragically, this didn't happen. In 1979 in Britain, we have election of the Margaret Thatcher government. Neoliberal economics comes in, Reagan in America. And the 80s is about a new, more aggressive form of capitalism, which does not seek détente with the Soviet Union, it seeks to destroy the Soviet Union. We have the Brzezinski doctrine, we have a new hawkish line, which reflecting the more aggressive form of capitalism, which takes root in this period and which spreads, unfortunately, around the world and in Europe. And if we're to analyze what's gone wrong in the world the last 20 years, we have to realize the economic changes which took place have a big bearing. Because in the same way that the economic changes took place, so did the foreign policy change. And in 1990, we had in 1989-90, we have, of course, the end of we have the Berlin Wall, we have the coming down, we have the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Western elites at this time, and my friend Michel Collin said quite rightly, when we're talking about the West, we're talking really about the elites in the West, the 1%. Who have been pushing these policies, these destructive policies. They had a problem. They wanted to recolonize the world. They wanted to recolonize Europe. They wanted to recolonize Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. But the YALTA-POTSDAM international settlement restricted them because it enshrined state sovereignty. Let's remind ourselves that this week also another important anniversary of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg trials. And the judgment at Nuremberg, the finding of the military tribunal, held that to wage a war of aggression was not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. It's so clear. You cannot wage war of aggression. The trouble is the 1% in the West needed to do exactly that if they were to get their way. And so we come up with this new doctrine in the 90s, this bogus doctrine of so-called humanitarian interventionism. This is the new departure in the 90s, that the West would try to re-legitimize warfare by doing it in the most benign, politically correct form possible. We're going to war with Yugoslavia because we want to help those poor people who are being killed in Kosovo. We're the good guys, and what Michel was saying about the 5 routes to propaganda applied absolutely there. And what happened here in this city, in this country in 1999, the importance of it can't be understated. Because here was a war that was blatantly illegal, sold on a false prospectus to destroy a sovereign state. And it was only the first of a long, depressing sequence of events. And we're often told, aren't we, that we hear this phrase, the war on terror. There is no war on terror. There is no Western war on terror. This is one of the biggest myths of international relations discourse. There is a war of terror. And I'm not just referring to the terror of people who are underneath the NATO bombs, the people in RTS television station Serbia here in the city who were killed, the makeup artists, the cleaners, who lost their lives because Serbian television wasn't putting out NATO propaganda, or the people on the passenger train in Serbia who were killed, all the civilians killed here. I'm not just talking about that, I'm talking about the way that the Western elites have used terror groups in order to achieve their aim of recolonizing, of destroying sovereign states. No, there is no war on terror, but what we have had is a war on independent, resource-rich, strategically important countries, which began here in the 90s with the destruction of Yugoslavia, which carried on Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, and the ongoing war against Syria. So it's important to get the terminology right. And the bogus war on terror cannot be more clearly shown by what's going on in Syria today, where the West have been backing jihadist death squads in Syria for the past 4 years in order to overthrow the Syrian government. And only today we have the obscene event of a NATO power, Turkey, bringing down a Russian plane, a jet, inside Syria. A Russian plane that was fighting against Islamic State terrorists has been brought down by a NATO member state today. And nothing can really, to me, really show the clarity of NATO and the bogus war on terror than that. Turkey, a NATO member, bringing down a Russian plane when we're meeting in this conference to talk about this. This is clearly not a clash of civilizations. We must not fall into that trap of believing this is not of that, because the most extreme jihadists in Syria have been backed by the West. We have Saudi Arabia, the strong ally of Britain, playing a key role in this too. The question now, if I may devote the rest of the speech to this, is to quote a certain Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, is what is to be done? We've analysed how we got to this point. What can we now do? And I think there's 5 important things that we need to do here in order to return to something like the world order that we had, that was respected. It's clear that the great advances that were made in that period from 1945 to 75 beyond were made partly because of the existence of the Soviet Union and the fact that the elites in the West knew they had to raise their game. They knew they had to give us welfare, the social state. But it's no coincidence with the fall of the Soviet Union, the social state gets destroyed and we have the corporatocracy state. So I think there's 5 things we need to be campaigning for and looking at. First of all, the UN. We've had a lot of talk about the UN today. We need UN reform and revival. We need, I think, a new Security Council to reflect the world as it is today. 1945, we have you have the UK and France. I think it's wrong that we have 2 countries here, separated by 11 miles from Western Europe on the Security Council. We have no countries from Latin America, South America, no countries from Africa, no Muslim countries. We need to have an enlarged Security Council that reflects more democratically the world as it is today. I think that's a very important step. And we also need to look at the veto, particularly the destructive use of the veto. For example, the United States, it's countless times they've used the veto to block any criticism or any meaningful action on Israel and the Palestinian issue, and that has been destructive too. So we have to have a more renewed, a more democratic UN. That's important. Second, NATO. And my colleague before, Mr. Schmeller, was talking about NATO. I think that we cannot get to a world of greater legality and peace while NATO exists. I think NATO has to be disbanded, and it would be totally hypocritical to say that NATO can be reformed. It's not. It's a war alliance. NATO is the biggest destabilizing force, certainly in Europe today and beyond Europe. It's not about keeping the peace, it's about destroying the peace. And we only have to look at Libya, what NATO did to Libya. Libya, the country with the highest standard of living in Africa, was bombed back to the Stone Age. It's now a failed state, magnet for jihadists, great healthcare, great university, education system destroyed by NATO. And so NATO has to be disbanded. We have to work on popular movements to work for that. 3, I think this is an important point which is sometimes overlooked. We need to look at international justice for the people who have committed these great crimes in the last 20-odd years. It's obscene that someone like Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain, is still around, making a fortune from his consultancies, coming out of the work he did here, bombing Yugoslavia, Iraq. We need to get these people arrested and put on trial for war crimes. The people, Bush, Blair, Blair. Because as long as Tony Blair walks free, and it makes the whole concept of international justice a total mockery. A total mockery. And of course, Bush. Cheney. And Cheney, yes, we can make a list. We know Clinton. Yeah. The fourth point, I think, is very crucial, is that Europe has to disentangle from the United States. And there are positive signs. Let me just quickly read from Mr. Juncker. The EU Commission President, Mr. Juncker, we can't let EU relations with Russia be dictated by the US. And this didn't get much coverage in Britain. I don't know if it got much coverage here, or in your countries, but Mr. Juncker on the 8th of October said that Europe must improve its relationship with Russia and should not let this be decided by Washington. And he said we should not... we cannot let our relationship with Russia be dictated. He used the word dictated by Washington. So this process of decoupling Europe from the US, which has been so disastrous, and it is connected to the takeover of parties of the left and the right in Europe by Atlanticist factions. The British Labour Party, which I was a member of, a classic example of the way under the Blair years hardcore Atlanticists took over the party. That process has to be reversed, and we have to get back to European leaders who will put Europeans' interests first. And nowhere can we see this more clearly than in the migrant crisis, where the United States, state after state, has said they will not take in any refugees. These people, 60% are from Syria and Iraq, others from Afghanistan. These are people are overwhelmingly coming from countries where the US has led wars, regime change, destabilizations. And the country more responsible for these wars is saying, sorry, we don't want anybody in from the countries that we've destroyed. And instead, Europe is taking in migrants, and the United States is letting Europe take that. And so again, an example of the United States passing the buck to others. And it's important to stress that America itself, the American people have also been losers from this process, because the 1% in America have been benefiting. The average American, the last 20, 30 years have been disastrous too. They've lost their jobs, unemployment, falling living standards. So this process hasn't helped the average American either. So we're not against, it's important to make that point. We're talking about the elites in Washington and not the average American. The fifth point, the fourth point is that we have to have the changes that must take place must be internal as well, because in 1975, Britain, as I said, had the lowest gap between rich and poor in its history. The only war we got involved with in those days, the only external war, was the Cod War with Iceland over fishing rights. And there was a one boat barged another boat. That was the action that Britain got involved with in those days. And how nostalgic we feel for that when we think of Britain in Iraq bombing Yugoslavia in that more peaceful period. We've got to get back to reclaiming our democracies, because what's happened is that the state has been captured by corporate interests. The military-industrial complex is out of control. We can only have a more peaceful foreign policy from the Western countries if we reclaim our democracies. And we can only do that by building mass movements. And there are positive signs, actually. In Britain, we've had the Labour Party changed. We have a new election leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who is an anti-war figure, surprised many people. And he's done that because of mass mobilization, really, of his supporters. So in order to get a more peaceful foreign policy from the Western powers, we really have to reclaim our democracies, really, to have more representative governments. that represent public opinion. We know what happened in Greece with Syriza, the disappointment, the capitulation of Syriza to the Troika, and so we know that there are many problems still lie ahead. But nevertheless, regime change, we hear that word a lot. Regime change really does begin at home if you're a Western European, particularly if you're a Britain or coming from America or countries that have been the most malevolent in this process. We've got to do our own bit for regime change. I remember that I was at an anti-war meeting about a year ago, and a Syrian lady who was a refugee, a migrant from Syria, came up to me and she said that she'd seen me on RT talking about Syria, and she said, "Oh, thank you for what you're saying about Syria." And she said, and I haven't forgotten this, she said to me that the fate of Syria today, Damascus is the new Stalingrad. And she said she was not an Assad supporter when she was in Syria, but she's supporting the government in Syria now because it is fighting for the survival of Syria as an independent country. And she said if Syria falls, then this is a huge setback for the world, really, in the same way that if Stalingrad was the pivotal moment in World War II. And I do believe that's true. I think that what happens in Syria now is of crucial importance because we've had Yugoslavia destroyed, we had Iraq, we had Libya, Afghanistan, and now Syria, there is a real chance of a defeat for the endless war lobby. And so I think the fate of the Syrian government, the fate of the Syrian state is so crucial. Russian intervention has been a game changer. We know that the British are very keen now to have another vote to bomb Syria. Ostensibly, this will be about fighting Islamic State. But we know this is not the agenda, and I can assure you that Mr. Cameron is not, his aim is not to defeat the Islamic State. His aim is still regime change. 2 years ago, he tried to bring us to war in Syria against the very government that's fighting ISIS. And now he's trying to get support for a war against the Islamic State, so-called, but we know regime change. And today, if anybody heard the news, we've had a Turkish jet shooting a Russian plane down inside Syria with, I think, the death of the 2 pilots unconfirmed. A very serious incident. So things are coming to a head. And I think Syria will be will be crucial what happens next in Syria. But I think we should end, I just want to end now to end on a positive note. I believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think we have gone through the worst of this terrible period of a unipolar world which emerged with the fall of the Soviet Union. We've had 25 years now of war, destabilizations, and I think the tide is turning. There are very tough battles ahead for us to return to a more a world order based on legality, where war and destabilizations are not taking place. But I think it's important to realize that if we want to get back to a world of equals, and I do want that world of equals, we have to fight both internationally for that equality and also in our own countries for greater equality, and understand that the two go together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.